When we think of the slave trade, the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade often come to mind. But there's another, lesser-known chapter in the history of human suffering, a trade that spanned over a millennium, reaching deep into Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. This is the story of the Arab slave trade, a trade that shaped cultures, economies, and histories in ways we are still uncovering today. The Arab slave trade began long before the European powers set sail to Africa. As early as the 7th century, following the rise of Islam, Arab merchants began to establish extensive trading networks across the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Sahara Desert. The Arab slave trade operated for over 1,300 years. Historians estimate that between 10 to 18 million Africans were taken from their homelands and sold into slavery through this vast network. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which primarily sent slaves to the Americas, the Arab slave trade dispersed enslaved people across North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, India, and parts of Europe. Black Africans, Turks, Iranians, Europeans, and Berbers were among the people traded by the Arabs, with the trade being practiced throughout the Arab world, primarily in Western Asia, North Africa, East Africa, and Europe. The main examples of Arabic slave trades are Al-Andalus slave trade between the 8th and the 15th century, Barbary slave trade between the early 16th and the early 19th century, Trans-Saharan slave trade between the mid-7th century and the 20th century, Indian Ocean slave trade between the antiquity and the early 20th century, Ottoman slave trade between the 13th and the early 20th century, Red Sea slave trade between the antiquity and the mid-20th century, Libyan slave trade started in the 7th century, ongoing. Today we will be focusing on the Trans-Saharan slave trade. During the Trans-Saharan slave trade, slaves were mainly transported across the Sahara Desert. Most were moved from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa to be sold to Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilizations. Estimates of the total number of black slaves moved from sub-Saharan Africa to the Arab world range from 6 to 10 million. The Trans-Saharan trade routes conveyed a significant number of this total, with one estimate tallying around 7.2 million slaves crossing the Sahara from the mid-7th century until the 20th century, when it was abolished. According to Professor Ibrahima Baba Kake, there were 4 main slavery routes to North Africa: from east to west of Africa, from the Maghreb to the Sudan, from Tripolitania to central Sudan, and from Egypt to the Middle East. The Arabs managed and operated the Trans-Saharan slave trade, although Berbers were also actively involved. Early Trans-Saharan slave trade. Records of slave trading and transportation in the Sahara date as far back as the 3rd millennium BC, during the reign of the Egyptian king Sneferu. Sneferu, or Soros, was the first pharaoh of the 4th dynasty of Egypt during the earlier half of the Old Kingdom period, 26th century BC. He crossed the 4th cataract of the Nile into what is today modern Sudan to capture slaves and send them north. These raids for prisoners of war, who subsequently became slaves, were a regular occurrence in the ancient Nile Valley in Africa. During times of war, the ancient Nubians were also taken as slaves by the ancient Egyptians. Another group of people who were involved in the slave trade at this time were the Garamantes. This ancient Hamitic people of the eastern Sahara region relied heavily on slave labor from sub-Saharan Africa. The Garamantes first emerged as a major regional power in the mid-2nd century AD and established a kingdom that spanned roughly 180,000 kilometers in the Fezzan region of southern Libya. They used slaves in their own communities to construct and maintain underground irrigation systems known as fagara. In the 5th century, the Greek historian Herodotus recorded that the Garamantes enslaved cave-dwelling Ethiopians, known as troglodytae, pursuing them with chariots. In the early Roman Empire, slaves from the Bantu African were bought and sold in the city of Lepsis. In the 5th century AD, Roman Carthage was trading in black slaves brought across the Sahara. Black slaves seem to have been valued as household slaves for their unique appearance. Some historians argue that the scale of slave trade in this period may have been higher than medieval times due to the high demand for slaves in the Roman Empire. However, the slave trade through the Sahara in the ancient times may have been rare as Saharan trade didn't reach large dimensions until the Arabs and Berbers introduced large numbers of camels into the desert. Trans-Saharan slave trade in the Middle Ages. The Trans-Saharan slave trade, established in antiquity, continued during the Middle Ages. Paul Lovejoy, the Canadian historian and professor at York University, estimates that around 6 million black slaves were transported across the Sahara between the years 650 A.D. and 1500 A.D. Following the early 8th century conquest of North Africa, Arabs, Berbers, and other ethnic groups ventured into sub-Saharan Africa, first along the Nile Valley towards Nubia, and also across the Sahara towards West Africa. They were interested in the Trans-Saharan trade, especially in slaves, as there was a constant demand for slaves in the Eastern Arab nations and Constantinople. The Muslim slave traders referred to these African populations as Zanj or Sudan, meaning black. Arabs would routinely acquire slaves through violent raids, followed by capturing them and sending them on dangerous forced marches across the Sahara to slave markets where they would be bought and sold. In North Africa, the main slave markets were in Morocco, Algiers, Tripoli, and Cairo. Sales were held in public places such as souks. During the era of the Fatimid Caliphate, 99 to 1171, the majority of slaves were Europeans taken along European beaches during conflicts. Aside from raiding, slaves could also be obtained by purchasing them from local black rulers. The 9th century Arab historian Yaqubi states, "They, the Arabs, export black slaves belonging to the Mira, Zagawa, Marua, and other black races who are near to them and whom they capture. I hear that the black kings sell blacks without pretext and without war." Few African rulers actually resisted the slave trade. In fact, many chiefs would become middlemen in the trafficking, rounding up members of nearby villages to be sold to visiting merchants. The 12th century Arab geographer Al-Idrisi recorded the different methods Muslim merchants would use to enslave blacks, recording that some would steal the children of the Zanj using dates, lure them with dates, and lead them from place to place until they seize them, take them out of the country, and transport them to their own countries. In 1353, the Berber explorer Ibn Battuta would record accompanying a trade caravan to Morocco which carried 600 black female slaves who were to be used as domestic servants and concubines. When Battuta visited the ancient African kingdom of Mali, the locals vied with each other in the number of slaves and servants they had, and he was given a slave boy as a hospitality gift. Slaves were transported through different routes, depending on their destination. Those headed to Egypt would be carried by boat down the Nile, while those headed to Arabia would be sent to ports on the Red Sea, such as Suakin and Asab. Slaves headed to North Africa would have to take the Saharan trade routes, which had been in use since around 1000 B.C. These include routes such as the ones from Tripoli, Gadam's, Gat, Hogar, Gao, connecting modern-day Libya to Nigeria, the Tripoli-Fezzan-Bornu route connecting Libya to areas of what are today Chad, Niger, and Cameroon, and the east-west route connecting Egypt to Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Kanem-Bornu-Zawila was another route to North Africa, as the Kanem-Bornu Empire in the eastern part of Niger was an active part of the Trans-Saharan slave trade for centuries, and the trade formed the basis of the empire's prosperity. Passage through the Sahara required the expertise of ethnic groups whose lifestyles were uniquely adapted for survival in scorching, arid environments, namely the local Berber tribes and the foreign Bedouins from Arabia. For example, the Tuareg and others who are indigenous to Libya facilitated, taxed, and partly organized the trade from the south along the Trans-Saharan trade routes. Various nomadic peoples played critical roles as guards, guides, and camel drivers. As a result, they were granted autonomy and treated as allies by governments of North Africa. Oases were vital way stations for caravans, and those such as Aljila, Gadamus, and Kufra in Libya allowed both north-south and east-west travel. Even with expert help, the passage could still prove deadly to merchants and slaves. Sometimes whole caravans of thousands of people could disappear without a trace. The goods exchanged in the Trans-Saharan slave trade varied. In the 10th century, the Muslim scholar Mutahhar ibn Tahir al-Maqdisi described the trade between the Islamic world and Africa as consisting of food and clothing being imported into Africa, while slaves, gold, and coconuts were exported out of Africa. Later, the 16th century Andalusian writer Leo Africanus wrote that traders from Morocco would bring horses, European cloth, clothing, sugar, books, and brass vessels to Sudan and exchange them for slaves, civets, and gold. According to Africanus, the Sultan of Bornu would accept payment for slaves only in horses, with an exchange rate of up to 1 slave per 20 horses. Male black slaves were used as laborers, servants, and eunuchs. Female slaves were also used for labor, but most would be used for domestic chores and concubinage, i.e. sex slavery. Eunuchs were around 7 times more expensive than non-castrated males. They were used as harem guards, administrators, tutors, secretaries, commercial agents, and even concubines. Due to strictures within Islamic law, slaves would not usually be castrated within Muslim territory, and therefore would be brutally castrated in their home country before being sent across the Sahara. Sometimes slaves were castrated after purchase in North African slave markets. Conditions within the mining industry were notoriously harsh, especially the salt mines of Basra, where tens of thousands of black slaves toiled in extremely miserable conditions, living on insufficient amounts of food. This poor treatment led to the bloody Zanj Rebellion, or Black Revolution. Yaqubi records that both male and female slaves were employed in the copper mines of Upper Egypt. The Carmatian Republic of Eastern Arabia is said to have employed 30,000 black slaves to perform all difficult labor. Some black slaves served in the military forces of North Africa. For example, the Zirid dynasty used black slaves imported from Sudan via Zawila. In some instances, Christians in Africa would acquiesce to Muslims' demands that they be provided with slaves. In 641 AD, a treaty known as the Baht was signed, establishing an agreement between the Nubian Christian state of Makuria and the new Muslim rulers of Egypt. The Nubians agreed to give Muslim traders more privileges of trade, as well as sending 442 slaves every year to Cairo as tribute. This treaty remained intact for at least 600 years. In Muslim societies of the Middle Ages, blackness became increasingly identified with slavery. This was justified by appeals to a specific interpretation of the biblical story of the curse of Ham. Ham had been cursed by Noah in 2 ways. The first, the turning of his skin black, and the second, that his descendants would be doomed to slavery. Certain Muslim slave traders would use this to justify enslaving blacks, including black Muslims. In the late 14th century, a monarch from Bornu wrote a letter to the Sultan of Egypt complaining of the continual slave raids perpetrated by Arab tribesmen, which were devastating his lands and resulting in the mass enslavement of the black Muslim population of the region. In Al-Andalus, the area of medieval Iberia under Islamic control, black Muslims could be legally held as slaves. This all occurred despite the Orthodox Muslim jurist position that no Muslim, regardless of race, could be enslaved. Even as late as the 19th century, many of the common people in Islamic society still believed that enslavement based on skin color, rather than based on religion, was approved by the religious laws of Islam. Well, they were wrong. In 1416, Al-Makrizi narrated how pilgrims coming from Takrur near the Senegal River brought 1,700 slaves with them to Mecca. In the late 16th century, access to slaves in the areas of the former Songhai Empire in West Africa were cut off due to the Moroccan army's invasion of Songhai headed by Al-Mansur, the Saadi Sultan of Morocco. Under the Saadi dynasty, Morocco's sugar industry was dependent on black African slave labor. According to Paul Berthier, the need for slave labor on Moroccan sugar plantations was a major reason for the 16th century Saadian invasion of the Songhai Empire. This necessitated the substitution of the former Songhai slave route with the Benghazi-Wadai route and others through Sudan. After Europeans had settled in the Gulf of Guinea, the Trans-Saharan slave trade became less important. Arabs were also sold during the Trans-Saharan slave trade. According to Ibn Butlan, Arab women were sold as slaves in Mecca, and certain rulers in West Africa had slave girls of Arab origin. According to Al-Makrizi, slave girls with lighter skin were sold to West Africans on Hajj. The West African states also imported highly trained slave soldiers.